Okay, so here's Making Henchman 21, and the first thing I did was I bring up the reference. And I wanted to get the reference not only because I liked this pose, but it also showed me all of his costume. I didn't have a good back view, but I kind of faked it a little bit, um, getting all those details. And I'm just using spheres and cylinders to rough in the form, right? You want to get in all the major muscle groups, you want to get your proportions set up, and you want to work out the pose. Because, yeah, I got reference here, but you got to make sure you can translate it. And it's not always that easy to go from 2D to 3D. So it's a good idea to be able to work it out. And doing it this way enables me to work everything out beforehand. Because if I've seen other guys, they like to, start with a sphere or a cube and pull and tug and remesh and pull and tug and remesh. And the problem is, you're still kind of stuck with whatever pose and proportions you put it in. It's difficult to change if you do it that way. At least it is for me. I know there's the pose brush, and you will see. I don't remember if I did it in this, but there are definitely ways to adjust your proportions and even your pose. But it's much more difficult to do once the figure is, 90% sculpted. You got a lot of vertices in there, unless you got a supercomputer, and I certainly do not. Things are going to be slowing down. It's going to get hard to work with near the end. So it is definitely, in my book, better to make sure you got all your proportions, you got the pose in good, and you're just working on the details. And you can res up as you go. You can't res down and res back up. There are issues with that, and I run into a little bit of that here. I'll talk about it when we get to it. I wanted to have, when I did his costume, I wanted to have sharp edges on some of it, and I have been able to sculpt in sharp edges, but honestly, it's really difficult, and it kind of requires a very high remesh, and a lot of vertices. And once again, I do not have a supercomputer, so it's really hard for me to do that. It's much easier to make sure I got everything underway at the box modeling rough stage. Even at the beginning when I start to join and remesh things, it's still easier to make small changes to the anatomy and the pose at that point than it is at 90% done point. By then, you're kind of set in stone. It's almost easier to start over. And here you see I'm just his utility belt that was basically box modeled. I went in and sculpted a little bit because it's kind of got like a sort of like a little bag look rather than like a box with hinges. So it's got sort of like a softer look. So I went in there and I put some of that in with sculpting, but it's primarily just box modeled. His whole belt. And you can see his wings back there. I really questioned whether it was even a good idea to 3D print those wings, because basically they're just flat shapes. And it might have just been easier to cut it out of something else, like wood, maybe, not wood, it would show the grain, which you don't want, but maybe plexiglass, or I don't know. But in the end, I did go with 3D printing them, just because I had that, and I did run into a little trouble with that, and I had to fill it in, um, and I could fix that. The second time around, it was just a matter of supports that I could have fixed it. Oh, here, I start to use the curve modifier, and I always have trouble controlling that. It doesn't really. I don't know. I see other YouTubers use the curve modifier and they seem to be able to get it to go just where and when they want, but it never works that way for me. It's always hard to control. So I used it to get the antenna roughly in the shape I wanted, and from there on I think I might have just adjusted it by hand. Applied the modifier and then just adjusted the vertices. And here you go, you see the wings. They're just flat shapes. Really, if I had a laser cutter, I would not have 3D printed them. I might have put it in there just to get the shape, and then somehow translated that into vectors and used that to cut it out on a laser cutter, because that probably is the best way to go with something like that, just a flat shape. But it worked out in the end, so not too big of a deal, I guess. You just see me adjusting them. Um, and I stressed a little bit about the thickness of this, because you can't hollow this out, right? This is all resin printed, and you can't hollow something out that thin. So do I make them 2 millimeters thick? Do I make them 3? 4 seemed too thick, but then I was afraid of warping. But in the end, they did not warp, which is odd. A lot of the like the print tests, which were small flat things, warped right the heck on me, and these didn't, which is kind of weird. And here you go. You see me starting the face, just roughing in some of the details. At this point, you just want to work slowly. And in fact, I think I kept the head separate way into the sculpt, because generally I need more vertices in the head and the hands than I do the rest of the body. And so then you run into the situation with you have a higher remesh on the head than you do the body. And it makes connecting them kind of an issue. When I connected them, I usually like to, remesh the whole thing and then go with a smooth brush and just make sure things are nice and neat. But you can't really do that, because it would increase the vertices count like exponentially, and it would make it unable. So I just kind of deal with it as best I can. And here you see me working in the eye sockets, and I kind of just did this out of habit, because you don't even really see his eyes. And in the end, that's kind of the realization I came to. I didn't go too crazy with that, because technically there's no reason to sculpt eyes in this one. You don't see them. His mask covers everything. But I'm fairly happy with the way he came out. He does look like Henchman 21 to me. There you go. There's some finger work, and I really like the way the hands came out in this one too. They're a little boxy, I admit that, but I left it that way on purpose because I wanted to make it look like he was wearing gloves, which he is. And they're a little stylized, but I still kind of like it. And Henchman 21 is kind of funny, because they gave him some musculature, right, towards the last season, but they still kept him kind of fat. So I wanted to show the muscles in the arms, and he's got pecs somehow, but he's still got a big old belly. So I gave him all that. And here what you see me do is what I was talking about earlier. I wanted his costume to have hard edges, right? So I box modeled the costume and then kind of sunk part of it into his body. And then when I Boolean merged them, I just kind of smoothed out the edges so that it blended with the body. The edges that needed to be smoothed out, like those ones on the outside, I wanted that hard edge because he's wearing like a overall kind of thing, which is weird, but that's Henchman 21 for you. So, and I was a little concerned how this would work, because Booleans in Blender are a little weird. And I've been meaning to do a Booleans video. I have come up with certain tricks that work most of the time when a Boolean isn't working for you. And one thing, make sure your scale is always set back to 1, right? Make sure it's manifold, because a lot of times if you're box modeling stuff, you could accidentally copy a vertices, so you got doubles or something weird could happen. Always check and make sure it's manifold, and then try your Boolean, and yeah, it won't always work. What confuses me a lot of times is sometimes the most complicated Booleans work without a problem, and then the most simplest ones will not work at all. It makes no sense to me. I wish there was like a Boolean manual on how to make this work. Okay, that's part 1 of the making of. And I will be back in a couple of days with the next video. So like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. Thanks.